Thank you, Aish, for the introduction. I am pleased to be able to moderate and participate in this conversation. Joining us, we have Rumaitha Al Busaidi, a co-chair of the DASIS Lab, as well as the Maldives Special Envoy on Climate, Sabra Noordeen, and Assistant Secretary General Volker Türk, also the Secretary General right hand on the Our Common Agenda report. We are literally coming in from all over the world, and this is super exciting. Let's get right to our conversation on confronting the obstacles. The first question I have for everyone is that we've seen the world make ambitious promises to young people and largely failed to keep those promises. For example, in 2008, the global financial crisis that represents one of the many setbacks for millennials around the world that we still have not rectified. Why are these unkept promises still happening, and what can we learn from that? So firstly, Volker, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Vera. I think the common agenda is a real opportunity for a massive transformation when it comes to engagement with young people, and to hear and listen to them in a meaningful way, and to make sure that we learn the lessons from the past. Just to give you one example, when the Secretary General 2 years ago, ahead of the high-level week where all the leaders of the world come together, when he wanted to focus the world on climate and the necessity to effect change on climate, he invited young people from all over the world to come to New York so that there is a lot of pressure put on leaders. And that really made a difference. So we know that this type of events, this type of engagement, where you actually listen to what young people have to say, especially when it comes to what the world is going to look like, it's extremely important. So I would also perhaps add one thing. I think it's better to think of conditions that are necessary for young people to have their voice heard and engaged with, rather than talking about obstacles. But that's just a personal reflection from my side. Over to you, Vera.
Thank you for that valid point, Volker. And let's hear Rumaitha's perspective on this topic. Rumaitha, over to you.
Thanks, Vera. We have always heard those words, that opportunities are being created for us young people and that we have so much potential that the world can harness for the good. But unfortunately, young people are still being held back because our potential, I would say, is not being unleashed for the world's recovery. And I'm not talking about only 2008. We're currently witnessing this as we're living in the middle of a pandemic that has exposed so many systemic flaws in the way the local and global system works. And today, as we actually continue to grapple with the impacts of COVID, I think the main reason why these broken promises are keep on happening is because it lacks inclusivity. It lacks including young people that actually are the voice of the future, that are capable of actually making the difference. And one key thing that we have learned from all of this is that we need to communicate with the world, that young people need to be on the decision-making table on what we see as crucial and important. And this is why we collectively actually came together to show what the world should actually focus on as young people. And this is the work that we did at the Davos Lab, a youth recovery plan that tells the world what we as millennials and Gen Z truly believe in, that should be the priorities that we must work on. And it is now available for everyone to actually read and see. So in short, as we rebuild from this pandemic, children and young people should be at the heart of our recovery. We should be enabled and empowered, just as Volker said, enough to have a seat on the table and make those decisions that impact us all.
Thank you for this valid point, Rumaitha. And let's turn the floor over to Sabra. Sabra, the floor is yours.
Thank you. In a world, I think, that has been feeling more uncertain, especially for young people, the last 2 years have been even more difficult. The disruption of education, separation from family and friends, loss of jobs, and the inability to plan anything has heightened those sentiments of uncertainty and anxiety. Perhaps one of the reasons why there is a perception of ambitious promises not being seen through is because there was a lack of a sense of urgency. Often in the midst of a crisis, getting caught up in trying to firefight and resolve the short-term issues has meant that policies and institutional frameworks that are needed to address those foundational matters are not adequately put in place. But the climate crisis and the pandemic has shown us that that's no longer an option. What we do now has to ensure recovery in the short term, but also a resilient future for all generations. And with regard to the climate crisis, the undeniable fact is that children and younger generations are amongst those most vulnerable to the impacts. They're also inheriting a problem that was not of their making. And this requires more young people at the table, the opportunity to translate activism to policy, institutional and financial support, and access to innovation and knowledge to build skills and develop tools that facilitate finding solutions to the climate crisis. We are trying in the Maldives to really include the participation of youth in our climate change response. Most of our key policy instruments are nationally determined contributions to the UNFCCC, and the legislation on our newly enacted Climate Emergency Act all prescribe a vital role for youth in our efforts to manage the climate crisis. I believe, it is vital for youth to have a seat at the table. It's not enough to just say, keep raising your voices. That has to be translated, or youth have to be given the opportunity to translate those voices to policy.
Thank you, Sabra, so much for these valid points. And we're moving to the second question. What are the main obstacles to listening to and working with the world's young people? Rumaitha, I feel that you might have interesting insights on that as a global youth leader. So over to you, Rumaitha.
Thank you, Vera. I think we have to recognize that we as young people, as a group, we are very diverse. We have different levels of education, racial and ethnic backgrounds, different lifestyles, and also we have to keep in mind that cultural context, like I come from a different country that has a different cultural context to someone in the US, someone in the Maldives, like Sabra, and someone in a different continent altogether. So it is often assumed that more experience is always better as well. And that's something that really kind of removes a big aspect of young people to actually be included in these ways that they can actually be listened to, and that the world community can actually work with young people. Certain types of experiences like attending certain schools or working in a particular profession tend to be valued more than others. And these values and assumptions only privilege a certain type of experience and don't leave room for all young people. And we need to recognize that more and more young people do have valuable skills and knowledge and make room for different kinds and level of experience. Also, the idea that young people don't have as much to contribute as adults is pretty much ingrained in our culture, according to research. And it says that as adults, we often perpetuate the same things that we were told once when we were young by adults who are older now. And this brings to work to the work that we actually focused on at the Davos Lab. We asked ourselves and crowdsourced answers from over 2 million people from 150 countries on the question, what would it be for you to be a good ancestor? And the answers were so powerful, with a key message that meant inclusivity, intergenerational partnership, that not only young people, but also the older generation, we need to all work together, practice active listening and involvement. And this is how we can actually get ourselves from the current crisis and ensure that our future generations as well would avoid such crises, because we are listening to each other to come up with an active solution. And a message to those who are listening and watching who don't fall under the young people category, I would say, think of your grown daughter, son, niece, or nephew. You know them as a child, always knew them as a child. But now as they grow up as a young adult, it can be very easy to fall into old habits. And now that they've grown up, it may be hard for many of you to transition to allowing them to make decisions on their own without your judgment. And that, unfortunately, you may find that you treat other young people in a similar way, even if they aren't your family members, without subconsciously. This is how we are ingrained in culture to do. So that's one of the main obstacles, I would say, to listening and working with young people. And I think as we kind of become more aware of the situation that we're living in, and I think with the pandemic, we've grown more aware of active listening since we've all been in lockdown with family members and people that we might not have spent more time with before. I'm very hopeful that this will definitely change.
Rumaitha, I can't agree more. Thank you for this valid points. And now I'm going to come to each of you and ask you, what concrete steps would take over the next 12 months to secure a breakthrough for young people and for future generations? So Volker, over to you.
Well, I've mentioned earlier the Common Agenda report that the Secretary General launched earlier this month. And one of the big novelties in that report is the engagement with young people. I mean, we make a lot of proposals that came also from youth groups all around the world on political representation, on better education, on internet access for everyone, on making sure that we also ensure that in the intergovernmental processes of today that young people are listened to and can meaningfully engage. And let me just say, apart from all these proposals, let me just say one thing. When I was young, I go back to my formative years, I remember I read a book by a philosopher, Hans Jonas, The Principle of Responsibility. And that book, which is really about the ability of humanity to destroy the planet, was so important for me that I wanted to dedicate my life to that. And that was when I was young, because I saw that, the fact that we can destroy the planet gives us the momentum to change things in the world. And of course, when in the 70s, in the 80s of last century, I saw that our economic, our social system, our environmental system is doing precisely that. And that was, if you like, when I was young, and it kept me, frankly, also young. And I think it's sometimes good to appeal to us who are a little bit older to remember how we were when we were young and what motivated us to do things in our lives and to change them.
That's brilliant, Volker. And Sabra, what's your opinion on that? Can you share your vision on the concrete steps for the future?
I think quite often young people's views are dismissed as being impractical or idealistic, but the youth aren't necessarily talking idealism, they're talking about survival, especially when it comes to the climate crisis. And it's not just their survival, but the whole planet's. Over the last month, I was able to sit with the Maldives Conference of Youth Representatives and discuss their concerns about the climate crisis. And they were very passionate and pragmatic and keen to get their views across despite many challenges. And some of these challenges include, a lack of institutional access, resources, financial support. And there's also an acknowledgement on the serious need for wider integration of sustainability and climate issues across government and increasing awareness, the difficulties of the bureaucracy of international climate negotiations and the lack of access as a whole. But despite this, I think young people all over the world have been remarkably resilient. So for me, the most concrete step that can be taken in the next 12 months is a truly ambitious and successful COP26. I think that will lead the foundation, that is the foundation for our future.
Sabra, it is brilliant. Rumaitha, a final word to you.
Thanks, Vera. So I would say I couldn't agree more with Volker and Sabra. I think just adding on to those amazing inputs, we need to change our frame of how we think. Instead of thinking that young people are at a deficit because they don't have much experience, we need to start seeing the opportunity for young people to build skills at a young age by contributing to the efforts that governments and businesses are actually doing. It's a massive opportunity for them, especially if they're looking for a progressive mandate. One result of the survey that we did was, and as a result of the pandemic as well, is currently our generation is a far more organized generation of young voters, consumers, and investors who are rallying behind urgent climate, fiscal, and social justice. And what better way to actually take on that opportunity to actually move forward and be progressive and grab it by the horns if not by including young people. I mean, we all have things to learn, young people and adults alike. And I would say let's treat each other as the leaders that we are and recognize that we can be leaders now, even though that there will be still room for growth. we can still acknowledge that and work together to make a difference.
Thank you, Rumaitha, and thank you all the amazing panelists. With this, I'm handing it back over to Aish.